Okay, so as we've been talking about in class, the scientific revolution questioned long-held beliefs. And so the impact of science on philosophy is known as the Age of Enlightenment. So what is that? Well, there you go. It's an intellectual movement that stressed reason and thought and the power of individuals to solve problems. Because of their belief of reason, it was also known as the Age of Reason. And so remember, a lot of philosophers then thought, if we were wrong about the universe, what other areas do we need to rethink? So they're going to question everything from sacred, right, religion, justice, the government, and of course, if you can tell by my symbolic picture, painted by Susan Cohen Thompson, human nature. So our two foundational philosophers will be found in England, and they will kind of they've been inspired by the science around them, and then they will set the tone and set the inspiration for a lot of the philosophers who come after them. So our first man is Thomas Hobbes, and he is our friend. He's like our friend Machiavelli, right? He has a poor view of human nature, and because of that, he believed that we should have an absolute monarch. And he writes these ideas in his main work, known as Leviathan, in 1651. So he witnessed kind of the chaos of the English Civil War, has a more pessimistic view of human nature. But what's interesting about Hobbes is while he believes in absolute monarch, he does not believe in the divine right. He thinks the people give authority to the monarch. So this was a drawing in his book. And so these are, human beings kind of giving over their ability to do whatever they want over to the monarch. And so this is Leviathan. And we do this in something called a social contract. And this will be an important concept in the Age of Enlightenment. And each philosopher will have their own version of this. So we turn over our natural rights. Someone kills my brother, I want to kill his brother. I give up that right to be ruled by a monarch. And thus we get stability, right, because of this. So our next important philosopher is John Locke, John Locke. Okay, so look at the dates here. So he comes after Hobbes, and he's probably one of the most influential philosophers in Western Europe, especially maybe the greatest one in the English language. And he wrote about everything, not only how we learn. He thought we were blank slates, and experience wrote on us, if you will, and created who we are. But he also he's famous probably in this country for his two treatises of civil government, in which we are reasonable human beings. We can govern ourselves. So he has a more positive view, right? He's the one who witnesses the Bill of Rights and the Glorious Revolution. So maybe he can be a little bit more positive. So he also started to articulate that we have human rights, that we are born with the right to life, liberty, and property, if this sounds familiar. And if the government does not allow you to have those rights, you can overthrow the government. So he will go on to influence some of the great minds of this time period. Okay, so they're influenced by Hobbes and Locke, and especially science, and the people who kind of the elite culture who want to think about these ideas like progress, that we can be happy now, that answers lie in nature, that we are reasonable, and that we should have the freedom to pursue our interests. People who believed in these things and like to talk about them were known as philosophers. So probably the most famous philosopher, even of his time, is Voltaire. He wrote letters to monarchs. He lived in the court of Frederick the Great. But he really went after these targets. And as you can imagine, he was not popular. And he used satire. So he'd write these bitingly funny essays and plays and things criticizing these problems, right? And he believed these guys kind of helped keep this going, especially religion. And he was a great proponent of free speech here. Um, and so, because of this, right, he would be thrown into the Bastille as a political prisoner a few times in his life. He will also be exiled to England, and that's where he kind of thought, man, those English guys, they've got it figured out with their Parliament and Bill of Rights and whatnot. Some other famous philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another hugely influential philosopher, especially towards the 1800s. And he felt that maybe liberty was the most crucial thing here, that man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. So we'll discuss perhaps in class what chains might be keeping us down. He's probably the most radical of our philosophers, and he maybe thought, there is such a thing as too much reason. So he'll kind of pick up this idea of a social contract, but rather between a person and their government, he sees the contract existing between members of society, and he called this the general will. I sometimes think he might have saw no government at all, right? That people would together rule themselves. And some of his ideas will be enormously influential in the French Revolution. And then another important French philosophe is Baron Montesquieu. And he was a student, or a studier, as I like to say, of government. And he studied the ancient Romans and the Greeks and even the current contemporary governments of his time. And he came to the conclusion that maybe separation of powers was the way to go, right? England had it figured out. They had this cabinet system, right? The parliament checking the power of an absolute monarch. And he thought maybe there should be, I don't know, 3 branches of government, if that sounds familiar. And he wrote this in The Spirit of Laws. So it's important to know these men and their books. But I know you were asking, what about the women? I'm glad you asked. So, so all of these men are questioning everything, right? Religion, things that people hold super sacred, but are they brave enough to question gender roles? I'm sure you know the answer to that. Of course not. So here are some of the more well-known women. Mary Astle, some of them, not Mary Wollstonecraft, so to speak, but certainly Mary Astle and some others were very wealthy. So they had the luxury of some self-education. And so she wrote a serious proposal to the ladies way back in 1694, where she said, okay, Enlightenment philosophers, you're questioning absolute government. If that's not okay, then why should a man be the absolute ruler in the family? If men are supposed to be born free, why are women born slaves? Mary Wollstonecraft, probably more middle class, but she's witnessing the French Revolution, and as these men were calling for an expansion of rights, they wrote something called the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution, and she responded with this, where she said, if women had education, right, we are equal to men. As you can imagine, this would take a long time to hit the mainstream. There were also women scientists. Margaret Cavendish, also a noblewoman, a philosopher, science fiction writer, right? She was interacting with some of the great minds of her time. Maria Winkelmann, she discovered a comet in 1702, but her husband was a famous German astronomer, and so he got credit for it. And it wasn't until maybe the 20th century before they acknowledged that it was in fact Maria Winkelmann. Her sons were also astronomers, and she believed that, women should have the equivalent education. Tycho Brahe, that we talked about, his sister was also a scientist. So, right, pretty early on here. So what are some of the immediate impacts? And we're going to look at politically speaking. But first, how do ideas in the book go out to the streets. And that transformation took place in salons. And Paris then becomes, kind of picks up the mantle from the English and becomes the capital of the Enlightenment. And in the wealthy townhomes in Paris of wealthy nobility, or perhaps the very wealthiest middle class, salons took place, right? In rooms, people would gather and talk out these ideas and how to make changes. Again, women are important here because they were the ones who held these parties. And they were known as salonières. And one of the most famous ones here is Madame Geoffrin. And she would have these parties. Here's a painting. And these women had to be very well educated. They had to know the books, right? They had to know who's who, and they knew how to bring in the right people to carry on conversation, to spread ideas. So this is how these ideas kind of go from the elite starting to make it more mainstream, and then these are the people who are going to start to take it to the streets. All right, so we've just been talking about absolute monarchs. Can they also be enlightened? Can you be an absolute monarch and rule by enlightened principles? Take a second and think. Are some candidates for the title enlightened despot, right? So this is an important vocabulary word. And so these were monarchs who, despot, fancy word for monarch, or autocratic ruler, who embraced Enlightenment philosophies. So you can see it goes only so far, right? So we talked about Frederick the Great. These are some good things he does, but again, a lot of them have to keep the nobles happy, so they're not going to completely help out the serfs. And we've been talking about Prussia, so this is what it looks like, kind of spread up what is today northern Germany into parts of Poland. Another candidate is Catherine the Great of Russia. She doesn't take over immediately from Peter. There's someone in between, and then she essentially gets rid of her husband and becomes the Tsarina. She is also kind of a believer, but not a doer. She wrote letters to Voltaire, the great philosopher or philosophe Denis Diderot in France. We'll talk about him in a second. Spent some time there trying to help her do these reforms. But she was a German princess who had to keep the nobles happy. So while she was able to spread the Russian Empire at its greatest height, boom, right? She didn't, again, do all that maybe she wanted, or really, I don't know. Again, can you be an enlightened despot and share your power? One person did it, and it did not go well for him. So he's a son of Maria Theresa, and he was probably the most enlightened. I mean, he went for it. Legal reforms, freedom of the press, religious freedom, what? Even for Jews and Protestants? Crazy. In Habsburg, Austria, what? Abolish serfdom? I mean, 100 years before even Russia does it. So he just goes for it, right? He was really a believer. But as you can imagine, people of Austria not ready. So he spent most of his rule fighting the nobles and the Catholic Church. And so he will be sick in battle, and when he dies, all of his reforms will be taken back. So you can see people are just not ready for some of these ideas you and I take for granted today in the United States. So here is Austrian Empire. You can see it takes in a lot of the German states here. Here's Prussia, and controls a lot of various languages and religions. Okay, so what is the legacy, right? Progress, right? You, the individual, is important, and secularism, right? We're starting to move even more further away from religion dominating people's lives. But to me, the great symbol of the Enlightenment is the Encyclopedia by Denis Diderot. And this is the first time